we are very grateful to the Protolang organizers for hosting this AppEEL webinar. And the theme of this webinar is the electronic book launch of the Oxford Handbook of Human Symbolic Evolution that Andy Locke and Christina and I have been editing for quite some time. And so Andy is going to open for us, but of course he's in New Zealand, which has its own time, and which is a bit remote from all of us. So what he has done is he has made a video. And so I'm going to share my screen and share this video with you. I'm trying to find the sharing of the sound.
I can see the image.
Yes, but because it share sound. Okay, so this should be fine. If not, please let.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
I'm Andy Locke, down here in Fortress, New Zealand. I was one of the two editors of the first handbook with this title, Human Symbolic Evolution. I can only just pick it up with two hands, in fact, and it may well be that you know it more by this version, which Blackwell's brought out as a paperback after Oxford refused on the grounds that the first edition had cost them so much that they were writing it off. I'm going to talk a little bit about what got us to do a first edition, and then I'm going to talk about very quickly what I think some of the third edition will look like. Chris and Nathalie will talk about the second and third edition. The second edition, the one we're talking about so much today and introducing and having speakers from, this is what we hope the cover is going to look like. So if you see it in a bookshop, be pleased. We're very pleased that you've been part of that volume. And we're delighted that we're able to launch it today after only 6, possibly 7 years of gestation. The original version took from 1982 to its publication date in 1996. This includes a little hiatus when Oxford actually managed to lose the whole of the manuscript for 3 years. Bit stressful, that. The first volume was conceived in a conference in Paris sponsored by UNESCO. It's where I met Charles Peters, who was the co-editor. We thoroughly enjoyed ourselves there and had a good laugh because the reasons for the Paris ban in the 1860s on having any papers in their linguistic society on the origins of language, because they were totally fatuous, was confirmed for us over 100 years later at this conference by UNESCO, where half of the people presenting were complete. Yeah, you know, you can say anything about language development. The first thing we were concerned with was, can we compile the data that you would need to know something about to make any statements that had any credibility about where language came from in human history and human prehistory. Our second concern was to make that data available and amenable to traditions of science, very much based in Chamberlain's 1890 statement of multiple concurrent hypotheses. It's not just a case of having one hypothesis and testing it. You have to have lots of alternatives and knock all of them out, not just confirm or disconfirm one at a time. You have to have lots of stuff that you're doing. Our second principle came from the mid-1800s British philosopher William Whewell, who has a principle of consilience. And consilience, most people have heard of it from Edward Wilson's book. Put simply, the idea of consilience is that if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and sounds like a duck, then you're going to be fairly certain that you're dealing with a duck. Consilience means that for a handbook of human symbolic evolution, you have to cast your net incredibly widely so that you have a large number of independent points from which a consilience will jump forward and say to you, well, yeah, you know, this looks pretty reasonable, that. One of the famous, to me, examples of this principle at work is when Ian Davidson and his colleagues proposed a question, put forward the question, could people have got to Australia without having had language? Because they needed to build a boat to get there. And lots of people had to build boats to make a founding population. Can you get lots of people to build a boat to go to somewhere that you cannot see without being able to talk to them, that you have to converse, you have to argue, you have to get your point across, you have to have the technology, you have to be able to explain the technology? Interesting questions that show you the way in which multiple disciplines come in to supporting hypotheses about the origins and elaboration of language. So that's what we were up to in the first edition. Times have changed. I think the discipline and the disciplines contributing to these issues are very strong. And these are things that Chris and Nathalie will talk about at more detail. I want to think ahead a little bit to a third edition, which will probably come out about 2050. Good on you, Nathalie. Chris and I probably won't be around. What I think is going to happen in the immediate future is that we're going to see more of a shift towards solving a problem that I, as a psychologist, see or used to see when I was teaching every new semester. Psych 101, first 2 chapters of any textbook that you might pick up and give to your students start off by saying, here is a chapter about science and how psychology became a science. Chapter 2, this is what an independent variable is. This is what a dependent variable is. This is how we establish psychology as a science investigating causes. And then from chapters 3 to the end, mentalism comes back in. People have purposes, people have ideas, people have projects, people have all sorts of things and make meanings to each other, none of which can be encompassed by a causal science. And we're seeing that brought out very clearly, say, by Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And his argument in that paper of if an explanation leaves something fundamental out of the equation, then it's not very useful. And given that contemporary cognitive science, neuroscience, whatever you want to call the stuff, has as much to say about computers, which I think is absolutely fabulous anyway, but nothing whatsoever to distinguish computers from human beings, all of whom we have consciousness, all of whom we are able to talk about what's it like to be a human being from the inside, not just purely objectively. So in my view, what's going to happen in the future is we're going to take into account more and more the fact that people make meanings, and in making meanings, they are making a whole world between themselves. And I think that in her recent book, Karen Barrett, who has a PhD in quantum physics and is a professor of feminist studies in the University of California, she's brought out a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And in her perspective, which she calls agentive realism, she puts a position, an ontology like this. Not long ago, CERN announced that they had discovered a Higgs boson. Fantastic. So Higgs bosons actually exist out there in the world, and they have found one. Barrett's view is to say, actually, in building this huge particle accelerator, what these physicists have done is to have made the conditions, created the conditions in which the unformed stuff of the universe can be squeezed into what looks like a Higgs boson. That there are no Higgs bosons until you accelerate things around the Swiss and French countryside at phenomenal speeds, and you make them. Now, this seems to me to be an incredibly powerful vision that fits our interests in evolution. That there are no templates out there by which the universe becomes stuff. It creates its own conditions and creates stuff as of itself. And this, I think, is going to revolutionize some of our understandings of culture, society, and the way in which symbols are created and manipulated, etc. So I'm very happy at this point to pass you over to Chris and Nathalie, and may I wish you the best of conferences. I have probably to miss it. I have not been well of late, and it's all a bit of a struggle at the end of winter. Good luck. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Andy, and also Tracy Riley, who is Andy's wife, who helped with making this video. And so now we are going to go over to Chris. Chris, please.
Okay. Thank you, Nathalie. And quite apart from the formal thank you to Nathalie for just sort of introducing me right now, I want to actually start by thanking Nathalie for setting up this online book launch, which is very much a kind of joint enterprise between Protolang, of which Nathalie has long been one of the organizers, and the AppEEL Lab in Lisbon, of which she is the initiator and head. So I think we should all give a big thanks to Nathalie for, for setting this up. Okay. I will now, take up some of the themes of Andy's brief presentation. I'm not going to take up the notion of a third edition. We certainly don't want to be thinking about that until we're actually really over the finishing line for this one. But what I think the first thing I want to say is this, that I was one of the contributors to the first edition of 1996. And in fact, my friendship and intellectual relationship with Andy goes back an awful long way, about 45 years. And we were, we were developmental psychologists at a time where there were some very interesting things going on in UK developmental psychology, all of which were focused around the issue of meaning. And we shared mentors, actually, who were quite important in our development, including Jerry Bruner, who was at Oxford before they managed to kind of prize him out for being insufficiently positivist, and John Schotter, who was Andy's supervisor. Anyway, so really this is just to reinforce the point that that he and I shared an orientation towards psychological science as being fundamentally grounded in the understanding of meaning and its development. That it's a science which does need to employ the techniques of natural science, but also needs to the foundations of the human sciences as well. And also, Andy and I were two of the few ontogenetic developmental psychologists around at the time who really thought that the evolutionary, phylogenetic evolutionary perspective was actually fundamental to understanding child development as well. Of course, this is by now, relatively speaking, a kind of truism, but at the time it was not. Since the publication of the first edition, in a kind of rather desultory fashion, after a while we kind of started to talk about maybe putting together a successor volume. But we were very much aware of the importance of getting somebody who was not only from a new generation of scientific researchers, but somebody who actually would share some of the fundamental kind of presuppositions upon which we work, and sophistication not only in evolutionary theory but in the philosophy of science. And that is why from its inception as an actual project, Nathalie has been crucial and to this volume. Okay, now I want to say now two other things. Being a science of meaning means various different things, but one issue that is really important, which we will be taking up in our introduction to the volume, is the importance of reflexivity. And that is an understanding of our own scientific endeavor as being, located in time. And one of the issues there is the way in which the sciences of evolution, including the science of symbolic evolution, has been inflected by, theoretical formations, which have been very much socially constructed. And this includes, of course, something which I think in 2021 we need to be aware of, which is the relationship between the sciences of evolution, including symbolic evolution, and the growth of European colonialism, about which I'm not going to say anything more now, but I think it is an important point. The other thing, and the last thing that I want to say, is that something that is, the notion of a science in time also forces us to confront some of our presuppositions about evolution. Now, mostly when we think about human symbolic evolution, we tend to take a retrospective perspective, right? We tend to think of human symbolic evolution as something that mainly, was going on in the past, including the deep past. In the first volume, basically, terminated, as it were, with the invention of writing. But that was a long time ago, and now, I mean, again, it's banal and a truism to say that the world has changed massively. We are now confronted with, a digital world in which it is quite evident that human symbolic evolution is an ongoing process in which, you know, we need to be cognizant of the way in which not only a retrospective but also a prospective perspective, that is our gaze into the future, is in some kind of fundamental sense, you know, inflecting our views of what it is to be human and what it might be to be human in the future. So, you know, I mean, if to come back to this kind of weird notion of a third volume, if a third edition, sorry, should there ever be a third edition, goodness only knows what, not only what it would look like, but into what context it would actually kind of, you know, be inserted. Well, anyway, I will finish now by saying, you know, that the other great thanks that that we all owe is, of course, to all you contributors, and also to everybody else who's here today, who's you know, taken the time to come in and join us in a little celebration of, at least, you know, we're at some kind of milestone on our journey, if not, certainly not the end of it. Okay, thank you very much, and I hand over to Nathalie.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I will give a very brief presentation and a very brief overview of the handbook that we have. And let me share my screen again. And then, so this handbook, of course, as Andy said, is a follow-up of the first handbook that he did with Charles R. Peters. And I know that many of the authors that are part of this handbook have actually used the previous handbook as one of their textbooks by which they learned about human symbolic evolution. And I was also one of those. That handbook was very crucial in the development of my thinking about human symbolic evolution. And I know that many people here also at Protolang have used this handbook for themselves. And so in that regard, it is very interesting to see the rounding of the circle. And so thank you very much, Andy. And I think that I speak here for Chris and I when we say that we are very honored to have been invited to co-edit this new edition. And in that regard, also, I want to say thank you to Chris, because it has been a real pleasure, and also, of course, with Andy, to work together on this volume. And so in that regard, also my personal thanks. So what is this handbook about? So the handbook has around 6 parts. Beyond the prefaces and the forewords and the introductions and the indexes, we have 6 parts. And so the first part is basically a part that handles the epistemological considerations that there are to study human symbolic evolution. So I have 2 chapters in there about the biology of symbolic evolution and about the different disciplines there are that today study human symbolic evolution, ranging from psychology to anthropology, archaeology, philosophy of science. So which sciences are there to study and comprehend human symbolic evolution? That's the first part. Then the second part is focused on psychological considerations of human symbolic evolution. And psychology here has been broadly conceptualized. So we have some evolutionary psychology, some cognitive psychology for e-cognitive thinking, also some behavioral ecology. So it was there also very broadly conceived. And then the third part is about the symbolic lifeways that there are, the kinds of beings that there are to be symbolic. And so here we have the anthropological considerations, and also in relation to that, the archaeological considerations of what it means to be human and what it means to be symbolic, and how do we how we are able to recognize that in the archaeological record and in the fossil record. And then the fourth part is about the foundations of symbolism, where we find the roots of it. And so here we have an etymological part And ethological here is also very broadly conceived because we have here some animal studies, but also primatological studies. And we even have a chapter there that goes back to viruses and that investigates the role that viruses might have played in the development of human social life styles. And then the fifth part specifically deals with language. So of course, if we look into symbolic evolution, language by far is the most symbolic of them all. And so here we have a part completely dedicated to the transition from proto-language to language. And then the sixth part has technological considerations, and that is also what Chris was already pointing towards. And what I think is the biggest difference that we have with the first volume that Chris and that Andy and Charles Peters made. And so here we have gone beyond the past, because human symbolic evolution and human evolution in general is always something that is projected at the past. And so we look into paleontology, anthropology, the origin and evolution of the mind, and this of course is very important. But we are a species that continues to evolve, and we are always evolving. And in that regard, we have also looked into a futuristic. We have looked into the future and looked into how humans as individuals and as groups are continuing to evolve. And so here we have Beyond the Writing chapter. We also have papers on cyber cultures and on the internet, how it is developing into a global mind and how that enables mind uploading, mind downloading, and a disassociation from the body into the extended technologies and into some kind of extended mind. So that is then the sixth part of this handbook. Now, the handbook is already online in electronic version. The hard copy, we have been told, will be available next year in September. So that is going to take some time, but so the handbook is already online on this website. And the URL is quite long, but so if you're looking at this video on the YouTube channel, I will be posting this link into the description of the video on the YouTube channel. So you can just go there and click on it. And the cover you already saw, Andy revealed the cover and it's there, but it's not on the website yet either. So we have to have some more patience there. So what we have done for today is we have made a selection of authors, not random, but we thought of taking one part only, but then we invited some people and then they were unable to join us and all. And so we have come up with these double sessions. And so this is a double session this morning. It's going to be Nick Enfield that is joining us from Australia, then Camilla Power, Ian Watts, and Chris Knight, who are in London, and then Antonis Iliopoulos, who wrote a paper together with Lambros Malafouris, is also joining us from England. And then this afternoon we have Luis Tirapicos talking about archaeoastronomy. Then we have Lana Ruk talking about artifact, praxis, tool, and symbol. In that regard, also, I want to point out that Protolang is arranging with Nathalie Gontier a commemoration of Bernard Bikajian, who was the former president of the Language Origin Society. And that session will take place tomorrow in the morning. And then we have two speakers which we don't actually know if they will be joining us, because April sent me a message this morning that she had technical problems with making her video. So I don't know if her video will reach us in time. And then Elizabeth Cully, we have not heard from her. And actually we hope that she's okay, because there is an ongoing pandemic and we have sent her several messages to which we have received no reply. So we hope she's okay. We hope that she can join us, but it might be that it is not the case. If they don't make it, then what we will do, Chris and I, is go over the different parts and the different chapters that there are and present the book more to you. Okay, so let me stop sharing. Let me start sharing again, because of course, very important. We already want to thank, of course, the authors, because you cannot make a handbook without the authors. And we also want to thank all the people that have been assisting us in Oxford, which is Martin, Charlotte, Janine, Afros, who is I think, a transhuman robot. It's an amazing woman. She's been doing all she's been chairing all the editing of all the chapters, and really impeccable. It's a pleasure to work with her, and also Victoria, who is putting everything online. So thank you very much to everybody. Okay, and so now it is time to move over to Nick, who has prepared a presentation for us. Nick, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, just can I check how much time do I have?
Half an hour. So 20 minutes, 25 for the presentation, and then 5 for questions.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, you must interrupt me when I need to stop talking. So I'll get on with it. It's a real pleasure to be invited to talk to you all, and it's lovely to see those of you who I know, and a shame that we can't, you know, hang out, have coffee or beer or whatever the case may be. It's very weird, but it's also kind of cool that we can connect in this manner. So so I want to also congratulate you on the book, and it's, you know, been a lot more work for you than it's been for us, and I can see that it's potentially something quite historic. So I'm very pleased and sort of grateful to have been invited to take part in it. And I'm very glad to be at this session, but I'm sorry that I won't be at the next one. It'll be past my bedtime by that point. So I will talk today about my chapter with Jack Sidnell, and he's in Canada. He's in Toronto right now, so we agreed that I would talk about the paper on our behalf. So the paper that we wrote for this, I mean, it was actually a very nice experience to be asked to write for this handbook, because it really kind of pushed us to think about some of the issues we have been writing about and talking about under the rubric of this kind of concept of an infrastructure for human sociality, a kind of an infrastructure for human interaction that we've been thinking about for many years, not just myself and Jack Sidnell, but colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen, and Steve Levinson particularly, who I worked with for many years there before coming to Sydney. So it was kind of nice to push us along and get us to really think about some elements of this kind of infrastructure for social interaction that we hadn't necessarily articulated. And the title of our chapter is this kind of, I can't remember the exact title, but it contains this kind of formula that intersubjectivity equals activity plus accountability. And this is something that we kind of started to develop more and more, and it's actually developed since we wrote the book, the chapter for this handbook. And that, you know, so partly the invitation for this handbook has helped us to articulate that. One of the ideas that we've kind of developed is for ourselves really is that language presupposes a kind of intersubjectivity which is pretty special in the animal world. I'll say something about what that is. But secondly, once you have language, then that type of intersubjectivity becomes truly enhanced. And it you know, when you add language to that, to sort of uniquely human intersubjectivity, you get this this enhanced form, which is the kind of intersubjectivity you need to make boats and you know, and all the rest of it in society. Where we want to start with this is to kind of define intersubjectivity not just as sharing perspectives. You know, imagine two people who share a perspective on something. For us, we felt it was important that intersubjectivity was more than this, and specifically, it really was about sharing perspective or experience in a public sense, in the sense that the people involved have made a kind of on-record commitment of sharing that experience. So one of the places where we start is to cite the philosopher Margaret Gilbert, who wrote a paper called Taking a Walk Together. And she pointed out that, you know, you can have these two situations. One is that two people arrive on a footpath at the same time and they're walking along next to each other, but it's just, you know, serendipitously on a city street. And we wouldn't want to say they were going for a walk together, as opposed to the two people who really are on a walk together. And she said, well, what's the difference between these two scenarios? Like an observer would say they see the same thing, right? Two people walking. And so she had a whole paper about this topic. And one of the key ideas was this idea of commitment, joint commitment to the activity. And one of the key things that she says in the paper is that this commitment is realized by the possibility, or it's evidenced perhaps by the possibility of rebuke. So she says in the second case, I can say, you know, if you start pulling ahead, you're walking faster than me, I can say to you, hey, you know, don't, slow down. I can't keep up with you. Right, so it's this kind of innocent little moment in an interaction, but it really to us was the kind of crux of intersubjectivity, which was accountability through the possibility of drawing attention to what was going on in the activity, and thereby drawing attention to the commitment that was made, but also essentially, you know, allowing that commitment to surface. And language is what allows us to do that. Such that we can coordinate around that activity. So I don't recall if we talk about the Gilbert example in the chapter, but what we do in the chapter is talk about some examples that we try to sort of build up from more simple interactions and more simple activities to more complex ones. So I'm just going to share the screen and show a few images. So you should be able to see this, I hope. This is an image from the paper, which is from a video recording of two men sawing planks. So you can see here, this is a two-person saw in operation, and it's a very simple form of, you know, interdependent activity. So one man is pushing while the other man is pulling, and then they get to the end, and then the first man now pulls while the second man now pushes. And so there's a kind of mutual monitoring that's crucial in this interaction. There's a kind of interdependence of the action. And it looks like a completely non-linguistic type of activity, but crucially, it involves this kind of mutual monitoring and mutual engagement. And it also occasionally involves the need to use language to kind of to regulate what's going on, to draw attention to kind of the need for calibration in what's going on, and it keeps the interaction on track. I'll talk about some of the differences, some of the other features of this type of interaction in a moment. And then we sort of stepped up in complexity to another type of two-person interaction, which is similarly kind of mediated by a piece of technology. In this case, is somewhat more complex technology than the two-person saw. So this is a complex object, which we kind of break down a bit how it works in the chapter. I won't go into the details now, but it's a two-person loom. Two people use this loom. It's pretty basic as far as looms go, but it's not that basic. It involves one person sitting on top of this structure and kind of shifting the warp and the weft one way and the other, while the person on the side has these reeds of different colors, and they feed them in one at a time. And so there's a kind of a process by which the two people have to do their respective moves in this weaving kind of scene, such that the moves are independent, that the moves are dependent on one another in particular kinds of ways. there is more choice here than in the case of the soaring. So in the case of the soaring, you know, there's only one thing you can do. In this case, there's a whole lot of different choices that have to be made at each step of the way. You know, the woman who's on top of the mat is either pushing it forward or pushing it back. That alternates. The woman at the side has to select reeds of different colors depending on what pattern they're weaving, and so forth. Similarly, this type of interaction sometimes looks to be completely non-linguistic, but it's actually quite often requires linguistic regulation. So just a little bit of sort of data from, we observed some of these weaving scenes, watching different pairs of people, and people differ in terms of how fluent they are at this job. So if you just look at this table here, the top row is a particular pair, a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, who do a lot of this weaving. They're very good at it. They make very few errors. And for each cycle, so this was, you know, insertion of one of these colored reeds, you can just time and average out the cycle, how quickly they go per reed. You know, they were doing this an average of just over 5 seconds for each one. And that speed, you can see then the different pairs got longer and longer per cycle, and the slowest one was this husband and wife pair, where the husband was basically not at all competent in this activity, and he was just filling in for a younger woman who'd gone off to nurse her child. So that speed kind of correlates with the amount of time you have to spend talking about the activity itself. So the real elite mat weavers don't talk about weaving. They chatter about other stuff while they're doing the weaving. So these are just completely parallel activities. But what you see is that, you know, the less calibrated you are in terms of the activity itself, the more you need to use language in order to regulate that activity, and to partly just to simply tell other people what to do and coordinate around the activity, but also to hold people accountable for errors that they're making, or you know, things that they're causing to kind of become less fluent. All right, so that's a big step up from the soaring to the weaving, but it's really still a quite primitive sort of type of interaction compared to conversation. And we talk a bit about human interaction in the chapter. Jack and I, of course, elsewhere have written a lot about the structure of human interaction, and I'm not going to get into conversation here. We could pick any conversation and find a whole set of elements that we've really been kind of charting out over the years. I don't mean we, just the two of us, but many people who are involved in research on language and social interaction have been charting out these kind of elements to an infrastructure for language use, and they include things like participation, so a system for how you get into an interaction, how you get out of it, how you display the kind of attention that you're paying to the scene, turn taking. So there's a very kind of linguistically mediated way of going back and forth between people in a conversation. There's turn taking in these activities such as the weaving as well, but that's very much less flexible than turn taking in language interaction. So-called action sequencing. So this is really about another level up, where we're not just talking about taking turns, but carrying out speech acts, and you know, what kind of a move elicits what kind of a response. Repair, structures of repair. So this is really quite a special feature of language that we try to highlight quite a lot in this chapter, which is, you know, the possibility of drawing attention to a problem in the talk and resolving it in the flow of the interaction. So it's very much parallel to the kinds of things I was just referring to in the weaving. So the less fluent the conversation is, the more likely you're going to have to use language about language to bring things back on track. Fifth, the generative, productive features of human language itself, syntax and morphology and phonology and the rest of it. And also, and more importantly, to my mind, this is something actually that Jack Sidnell has been trying to convince me for years is the most important thing about language, and that is its self-referentiality, its reflexivity, the possibility of language to be used to refer to itself. So I'll say some more about that before I finish. So we present this table in the paper, and it's where we kind of talk about comparing these three types of activities on a few parameters, and just to sort of talk about what they have in common and where they diverge. So we've got three columns there, one for the sawing, just the two-man push-pull saw activity, one for the weaving, and one for conversation using language. And we see a few ways in which they're really, to our minds, identical. They require a certain amount of common ground. The people involved need to agree on what they're doing, commit to what they're doing, monitor the other person and adjust their own actions according to the timing, for example, but also the content of what the other person is doing. And fourthly, have language available for explicit regulation of the activity where needed. So, you know, language, of course, is in some sense kind of treated as just the same as any other activity at a certain point when it requires regulation, when things go off the rails, for example. Then we talk about some of the ways in which conversation involving language then quite quickly diverges from these other much more restricted ways of interacting with others. So, for example, with language, you don't know what the next move is going to be, and that's you do with the other kinds of activities we looked at. You don't know who's going to make a move and when in advance of when that happens. There's a bunch of sometimes you do, but a lot of the time there's self-selection, and it's completely flexible in that sense. I'm not going to kind of go blow by blow through this table just for in the interests of time. So what I might do is move on from that. I'll just stop sharing because I don't have more images, but what I want to do is kind of just summarize first before finishing. So the point of going through those three types of interaction is to build the case that activity is sort of foundational to the way that language is used. For us, it's really about using language and also language itself being, you know, at the same time, an activity in itself, but also a tool for regulating activity and a tool for coordinating our activity primarily. And of course, you know, oftentimes that activity is about exchanging information. But to us, in sort of certain interesting sense, that's kind of secondary. So there are interesting effects around language being this sort of two-track phenomenon. So Irving Goffman and then later Herb Clark kind of made reference to this idea of an ancillary track or a collateral track or a second track in language use, where, you know, on one track you have the language that's being exchanged itself. You're talking about some topic, giving a narrative or whatever. But you always have this second track where language has to perform a second role, and that is to regulate itself, to regulate its own interaction. And that's why words like, for example, used for repair, or, you know, just so-called discourse markers like okay and so forth, used for kind of marking transitions within narratives and so on. Why that type of material is really fundamental to language, and is you know, certainly as important to language as anything you know, to do with the generative syntax that underlies it all. So what I want to do before finishing, I'm just going to try to wrap up so that we can have a little bit of conversation about this. I want to come back to this point that that my colleague Jack, my co-author Jack Sidnell, has sort of pushed particularly to me over the years, trying to convince me of, and that is the importance of the reflexive capacity of language. So Charles Hockett famously, put out this paper in 1960 about the what did he call them, the design features of language. And he didn't include reflexivity in the first version of that list, but a few years later, he updated that list and added reflexivity as one of the unique features of human language, as he put it. And what he means is that language can be used to refer to language. And the more we think about this, the more we see how important a thing that is. So when you can use language to talk about language, it means that you can do obvious things like quote somebody's speech. And that's the sort of one of the first things that people think of. But I think that has some quite interesting implications that we really, I think now going forward, we really want to kind of follow through. So let me just kind of mention, I think, two things where I'd want to emphasize we could think a lot more about. So one is about this talk that I already mentioned, which is to say the possibility of rebuking others for what they're saying through the possibility of describing what they're saying. So accountability directed towards the activity of language itself is crucial to what kind of a thing language is. And it's what allows you to regulate language itself through language. So that's one kind of, I think, big topic that we need to understand more about. And a second kind of fundamental consequence of reflexivity is simply the possibility of reputation. And we know, of course, that reputation is this incredibly powerful thing. People have pointed to it in terms of, the relation between, sort of early, the relation between language and social structure. Reputation is this very important thing. And we suspect that reputation is really grounded in this reflexive property of language, particularly because so much of reputation is he said, she said, right? It's about what somebody said at another place and time. So the possibility of quoting people's speech, isn't only used for regulation, referring to speech isn't only used for regulation of an activity at that time and place, but by combining a reflexive function of language with the displacement function of language, talking about, what happened at another time and place, that's your engine for reputation. That's your engine for gossip and all of the stuff that kind of is very well established around that. So we feel that the reflexive nature of language is something that's, I'm not sure, I'd be interested to know what you all think as to whether that is somehow under explored, or whether we know what we need to know about that. So I want to wrap that up here and just kind of reiterate that the interest that we have in this is really to try to continue to flesh out this idea of an infrastructure for human interaction and an infrastructure for intersubjectivity, part of which we think is really fundamentally linguistic, because it's language that allows us to have the kind of accountability that we're interested in. That is the kind where I can thematize something that you've done or you've said in this activity, and then I can characterize it in a certain way that's either going to be, praising you or blaming you, or somehow evaluating the nature of what you've just done. And so, we're continuing to develop that, and we are grateful for the opportunity to have kind of got a push along by working on it for this handbook, and humbled by all the amazing stuff that's also exists in the handbook. And so I'll leave it there, and thank you once again, and I wish you all the best for the rest of this for the rest of this fun party, for which I'll only be here for this first session. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. There was a question already from Marie-Adrienne. Please unmute yourself and please go ahead with asking your question.
Hi, thank you for this session. I'm really interested in intersubjectivity because the linguistic analysis there. I was just thinking about, maybe I might have missed this, but in conversation and language, how does intersubjectivity relate to intentionality? Have you?
Well, I mean, I suppose, of course, intentionality is one of these words that people could take in a few different directions. But if we simply take it to mean the property of language as being able to be directed towards things, so intentionality in that sense, that, propositions are about things, then, intersubjectivity presupposes intentionality, but it's really joint intentionality that's crucial. And, I think this would be the terminology that Mike Tomasello and many others would use. And that is that, I can direct my attention and my perspective towards something, and then you can direct your perspective towards something, and attention towards something. So there's sort of two people with their intentionality on something. Well, that in itself is not yet sufficient. What's crucial is that that direction of attention and intention is aligned in this kind of public sense that I expressed before. So that we are equally committed to this as a shared experience, and that's kind of out in the open. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
JT, you also have a question.
Oh, thanks, Nathalie. Thanks, Nick. That was fascinating. Two quick sort of thoughts. I don't know, regarding your question about language to criticize language when we comment on or correct what somebody just said, or what did you mean by that? I wonder if you've looked at any of Wilbur Schramm's 1954 model of communication with two people talking and the feedback loop, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, just in terms of how much feedback do you get every time somebody takes a turn. So they either say, what do you mean by that? Meaning I'm confused, so I didn't get the message at all. Or by commenting, they say, I accept what you've just said, plus I would like to add this point. Anyway, just thinking how much cybernetics or Wiener, if you've looked at any of that, or other researchers have. And the other quick point was, I used to work in game design, and we used to have talk trees where when your character comes up to another character, in some games, you just have a limited amount of options to what you want to ask them. You might want to say hello, talk about the weather, or ask them why there's a dead body lying on the floor next to them, or something like that. So have you done any talk tree explorations of these sorts of different possibilities? Because soaring and weaving and then talking, it seems to be an exponential curve of, well, there's only two things you can do, push or pull, but then you can weave a few more moves. But the amount of moves in language is explosive, combinatorial sort of possibilities. Anyway, just wondering what you thought.
Yeah, sure. So just taking the second one first, it's just impossible to do that kind of talk tree thing for linguistic interaction unless you're talking about really functionally very narrow, so I mean, over the years, we've talked to computer scientists who are interested in human-machine interaction, and they can get pretty decent things going for, an app that helps you design a bathroom or something like that, but, it's like the difference between, it's like the problem of, artificial general intelligence, the idea that you can get an AI to have an actual, free conversation with you. this is the reason why so far it can't, because you can't kind of get it to, you just can't anticipate all the possible things where it could go, and somehow humans are quite able to do that, and that's the generativity of language. Going back to your first question, so I'm aware of that work, the cybernetics work and so forth, and I haven't kind of really worked with it explicitly, but the model that we use when we're thinking about interaction is really kind of, we developed this idea of the n-chronic timescale for language, as opposed to, alongside diachronic and synchronic and the other various frames, or ontogenetic and so on. We've tried to single out the n-chronic timescale of language, which highlights the interdependence between each move in an interaction in a sequence. And one of the key things about that model is that it takes every move to be at some level an interpretation of the move that came before it. So whether it's about that move or whether it's simply a response to that move, it gives evidence of how the second person understood it. It gives evidence of how the second person sort of stands towards it. And so all of that is data essentially for you in an interaction, whether it's explicit feedback or not. It's still feedback, I think, in that larger kind of cybernetic sense. So that's how we think about it. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
There's a question from Camilla as well.
Hi, thank you. I can't raise hand properly for some reason. Thank you, Nick, because that idea of intersubjectivity, activity and accountability, I think it's a very interesting one. I was struck by the table with the analysis of the weaving and the chatter, going down from the very silent and efficient mother-in-law, daughter-in-law pair, compared to the mother and daughter, who were really quite slow and chatting a lot, and then the husband and wife. So now, is that is some sort of socio-political scale there, but is that, going towards more chance of relaxation or more chance of rebuke? Or how would you interpret this going on?
So probably, yeah, I mean, I think the kind of thing that we were counting there, I was just sort of, we didn't really count the amount of speech about weaving, quantitatively, but what we're referring to there is effectively undesirable at some level. So it's when you have to talk about the activity rather than just do it, that's holding up the progress. It's drawing attention to the lack of fluency in the interaction. It's you'd prefer not to have that. So in the husband and wife situation, we actually give some of the data in the chapter in this handbook where it's the wife is very well, I don't know, she's very unbridled in her kind of critique of his pathetic kind of weaving, whereas the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law pair, very restrained, as you might imagine. And so in that case, I think they have a motivation. I mean, I think it's very much tied up in those kind of kinship rules where you've got, a virtual avoidance style of relation, giving people a strong motivation to not draw attention to the disfluencies in the activity. So whereas with the husband and wife, it's like, yeah, whatever, we've got plenty of time. It's not as if people are really in a rush, but I think people are. So one of the ideas we develop is the idea of a tyranny of accountability. And I think that, when you enhance that through those kinds of social relations, people just get a real sense, a stronger sense that this accountability is always there. At any moment I can be called out. So if I'm in a relationship where I'd rather not have that happen, then I'm really gonna try to make this activity run smoothly. And I think we're seeing something like that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for people that want to raise questions, how to do it, so either you make that known in the chat, or if you go to the reactions under the different icons that you see there, you have the icon that says raise hand. And so if you push on that, then we also see if you would want to ask a question. So the organization provides around 5 minutes in between talks, but I think we are just gonna let things flow. So if there is another question, there is time for one more question. Yes, Chris, please, Chris Knight.
Well, the other nice thing was when you had, one of your categories was next move. And of course, as we all know from Noam Chomsky, the creativity of language is essential to what language is. And what I like about everything you do is the way in which you rather subtly but wonderfully introduce politics into your analysis. And I was just reminded of a rather ancient these days, I suppose, Maurice Bloch's description of authoritative language in a merino village in Madagascar, and he was just pointing out that when you have top-down authority, dominance and subordination, you can tell what the elder, as he's opening a speech, what he's going to say next. And so, as Bloch points out, you're in any situation where you don't have what you're talking about, where you don't have accountability, language turns into its opposite. It turns into a verbal ritual. You know what he's going to say next, and I imagine you're also, you know, you're balancing between this intersubjectivity and accountability, balancing between that and the opposite political conditions, which would actually prevent language from even existing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I guess the one thing I would add to that would be to say that there's I love that observation that you make, drawing that to attention to what Maurice Bloch remarked. In my colleague Paul Kockelman's work on agency, he defines agency as this interplay between flexibility and accountability. And one of the points he makes is that the greater flexibility you have over a certain action or semiotic process, you know, the greater accountability you can invite. And so the less flexibility you have, so I don't know, so something like an involuntary body spasm or something, as opposed to, you know, a controlled action, that you're less likely to be held to account. I mean, these are just obviously tendencies, but there's a kind of scale there. So the more ritualized, the more predictable something is, then the less likely you are to be kind of held responsible for having selected that move, as opposed to just having simply done it because that's what one does. And, you know, I think then it would be interesting to explore the decline of situations where, or of sort of relations between moves where a certain next move is highly predictable versus not very predictable, and clearly there is a kind of decline, right? So if we do a greasing sequence, I can be pretty sure what you're going to do next. Or if I ask you a yes/no question, I'm really constraining the kinds of things you can do next. Whereas in other types of moments in the course of conversation, you know, there's anything could happen. We could have a lapse. You could just, you know, sort of step into a slightly different topic. And so be going quite beyond anything Noam Chomsky would have ever talked about. I think that the dependencies between moves is actually a really interesting and probably underexplored kind of place to measure flexibility, to measure, you know, not recursion or anything, but, you know, freedom of possibility between one point and the next. Thanks for your comment. So nice to see you all.
Yeah,
I wish we could.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nick, for this very interesting talk and for your contribution to the handbook. And so now we're going.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
so now we're going to go over to Camilla Power, Chris Knight, and Ian Watts, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Nathalie and Andy and Chris, for all your work on this mega project, and for inviting us to talk here today. Our paper, The Symbolic Revolution, a Sexual Conflict Model, is really revisiting a paper that we did on the human symbolic revolution right about the time that was published the very first symbolic handbook. And we are still defending, this may not be fashionable, but we still defend the idea of a symbolic revolution. And we align the process of the emergence of symbolism with our speciation. So what I'd like to do first is ask Chris to talk about, well, what is actually revolutionary about the symbolic? Can we do that?
Okay, well, I'll dive straight in. Culture is, of course, very interesting to study, and that's what we do. But it presents no theoretical challenge to Darwinian evolutionary theory. After all, as we all know, many animals, including our closest great ape relatives, have cultural traditions, local ones, which they pass on from generation to generation. So symbolic culture, now that really does present a theoretical challenge to Darwinian theory. And that's the topic of our contribution to this volume. So what is symbolic culture? And for me, one of the best definitions was that provided by the archaeologist Philip Chase many years ago, and I'll quote from him: "Symbolic culture requires the invention of a whole new kind of things that have no existence in the real world, but exist entirely in the symbolic realm. Examples are concepts such as good and evil, mythical inventions such as gods and underworlds, and social constructs such as promises and football games." And perhaps delving a little deeper, we have the philosopher John Searle, who famously distinguished between brute facts and institutional facts. And according to his definitions, you have birth, you have sex, death, gravity. These things are brute facts. And by that, we mean that they're things which are true anyway, irrespective of faith or belief. So you might be walking off the edge of a cliff and you don't believe in gravity, but it makes no difference, you'll still fall and hit the rocks below. So brute facts are that sort of facts, the facts that physics and chemistry, physicists and chemists can study, they exist anyway, but marital status, citizenship, or money, these things depend entirely on common. All these institutional facts depend entirely on a subjective factor, namely belief, that doesn't stop them from being objectively true. So you can have a £10 note, another £10 note, and together they add up to the value of £20. Except that, of course, imagine a collapse of confidence in the currency, and suddenly all the various bits of paper are worthless, and the facts themselves have dissolved because of a loss of faith. So the way I think we're putting it is that uniquely in the animal world, we humans inhabit not only reality, not only the world of brute facts, but also a world of commonly shared beliefs, virtual reality. And our starting point really is that this kind of reality existed long before the world of digital technology, computer screens, smartphones. After all, language itself is a system for navigating within virtual reality. As Nick has explained, it can have some relationship with brute reality, with weaving or a saw and so on, but language itself doesn't impact on brute facts. And in fact, had our ancestors not begun moving around within virtual worlds, they would never have needed words or grammar. And I'd put it even more strongly, language itself would have been completely pointless and theoretically impossible if humans hadn't, through other methods from other sources, non-linguistic sources, and we were saying ritual, if language itself hadn't, if virtual reality hadn't begun to envelop our ancestors. So the challenge we face is to remain true to Darwinian premises. And of course, no form of Darwinism has ever been designed to explain hallucinations, to remain true to Darwinian premises while explaining how, when, and why it began serving the fitness interests of our evolutionary ancestors to lose their former anchorage in brute reality and move into worlds of hallucination and shared fantasy.
Thanks, Chris. So now I want to ask Ian to consider the archaeological evidence and perspectives of the symbolic revolution and how that timeline runs against our speciation.
Thanks, Camilla. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Our African speciation was a two-stage process between a little over 300,000 years ago and a little under 200,000 years ago. The earliest consensual evidence for symbolic culture is around 100,000. Beads, geometric engravings, burials with grave goods, and painting kits. This apparent mismatch has caused archaeologists and paleoanthropologists a huge headache for the last 35 years. The only unifying trait among these early indications of symbolic culture is red ochre. So I'm just going to share the screen. Before 100,000 years ago, the only repeatedly found evidence directly bearing on signal evolution in genus Homo is the record of earth pigments, red ochre, hematite, and its glittery variant, specularite, going back about 500,000 years. The co-presence of specularite with red ochre and plain hematite leaves little doubt that these earliest occurrences from South Africa's Northern Cape are the residues of pigment production. Ethnographically, specularite's only known use is for visual display. Since Durkheim, social anthropologists have considered costly group ritual to be the critical mechanism by which the shared fictions discussed by Chris came to be established and faithfully transmitted. We can be fairly confident that the specularite, red ochre, and hematite found in the Forest Smith levels at the back of Wonderberg Cave, where it's pitch black, testify to brilliant firelit ritual display sometime between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. The nearest hematite outcrops are about 50 kilometers away. These earliest occurrences aren't restricted to Africa. They have isolated counterparts in Europe and India, suggesting a shared adaptation to a shared problem by a last common ancestor of Neanderthals and ourselves. Behaviorally, they associate with early evidence for a campsite-focused form of social organization, with its requirement for unprecedented levels of trust. 25 years ago, we proposed a model of the origins of symbolic culture, which placed female reproductive strategies center stage. It generated predictions across a range of disciplines. Among the predictions of the pigment record was a shift from irregular to regular use of red ochre as Homo sapiens' brain size maximized, and that this should be evident by about 160,000 years ago. We also predicted that this shift should be relatively rapid, as it was premised on a runaway sexual selection process. At the time, this couldn't really be tested. The best I could do was identify regular use in Southern Africa from about 110,000 years ago. With improved dating and new sites, things have changed. This shows the changes in relative frequency of pigment measured as a percentage of the combined lithic and pigment assemblages through the Petersburg Middle Stone Age layers at Border Cave in northern KwaZulu-Natal. The bottom of the sequence, down here, is estimated to be 250,000 years old. In this basal layer, I had to search through about 10,000 lithics to find a single pigment on the threshold of archaeological visibility. Sometime between 183,000 and 160,000, we see this dramatic 5-fold increase to minimal levels that are maintained thereafter on into the ethnographic present. This was the sole piece found in the basal aggregate of Beaumont's first excavation at the site in 1971. He suggested that such specular hematite came from 120 kilometers away from Ingwenya Ridge, where Middle Stone Age miners were targeting precisely such a variant from more than 50,000 years ago. Together with the procurement distances proposed for some of the Forest-Smith pigments in the Northern Cape, this counts against any suggestion that, by the standards of the time, the earth pigment used in ritual display constitutes a cheap form of signaling. Virtually all caves and rock shelters in southern Africa, dated to 170,000 or less, show regular use. The latest addition to the list is another Petersburg site, Iliopoulos, with huge quantities of specularite and hematite, just dated to around 150,000. Before 170,000, the picture is much more of a mosaic of no use, irregular use, or localized regular use. This seems to be a case of quantitative change in ritual display reaching a tipping point where it became a qualitative change, right at the end of our speciation. Not only was this theoretically predicted before the data was in, but the content of such displays was predicted to be a form of blood symbolism, establishing that some things are sacred, shared fictions over vast landscapes. I'll now hand you over to Camilla, who will explain why, from an evolutionary perspective, this was the case.
Thanks, Ian. It's really a truism that trust and cooperation must be the context for the evolution of language and symbolism. I see Slavomir here, his phrase platform of trust is a really valuable one. People have often focused on we intentionality as a critical step, collective intentionality. But what is quite surprising is that the major social context that's been cited as the place for the evolution of we intentionality has in fact been warfare in terms of group on group conflict, creating group identity and shared sense of us. Now, this isn't just hawkish, who we might call hawks like Richard Wrangham and Steven Pinker, but also people we'd really think of more as doves like Michael Tomasello and his colleagues in their 2012 contribution. And developed from there, the archaeologist Curtis Marion, the archaeologist of the Southern African Middle Stone Age, has cited group on group conflict among emerging modern Homo sapiens of Southern Africa, coastal foraging niches, as the place where there would be selection for group-mindedness, we intentionality and social norms through conflict over resource-rich areas. Now, just to describe how, just to quote Marion on how he sees this as motivated, he talks about the main reproductive prize driving the competition being a concentration of females and offspring, which to an antagonistic group can be viewed as potential mates, slaves, or food. So this gives us a bit of pause that we're envisaging here the emergence of group-mindedness, social norms, ultimately morality, being predicated on rape and cannibalism, effectively. Now, apart from the fact that this does not well describe what we know about African hunter-gatherers historically, let's just consider, if I share the screen now, consider what might be some of the implications of this warfare hypothesis as it's been developed. For start, I don't understand, and I don't think it's likely that a warfare hypothesis would generate any form of sexual morality. If we have a situation, group on group conflict with intensive territorial struggle, it's not clear how that would create widespread cooperative networks across the landscape of the kind that Ian has described. when it comes to a ratchet effect of cumulative cultural evolution of social norms, if we have group-on-group conflict, this is going to look like a really localized hodgepodge, with one group winning one day, another group winning another. And because male coalitions are likely to be at the heart of the signaling strategy that arises, surely they are going to be trapped in brute reality, because enemy male coalitions are actually not going to be impressed by signals that are symbolic and tokenistic. The killer for the warfare hypothesis is really this one. Energy that's diverted to warfare and violence is going to correlate in a negative way with energy that supports very large-brained offspring. In fact, we would predict a retreat from increased brain size and decrease of brain size in respect of that. So if we actually do look at a recently published brain size charts, the blue circles here for middle to late Pleistocene Homo sapiens, Jebel Ehud is just there at 300. And then this is the second stage of speciation coming after 200,000. And we can see that increasing brain size already militates against a warfare model. In which case, I'm going to try to reach to an alternative hypothesis. I like the way that Andy was talking about the need for testing alternative hypotheses right at the beginning. And I'm going to look for Christopher Boehm's idea of reverse dominance. And he framed that in terms of war on the alpha male. So he envisaged morality and collective intentionality, re-intentionality arising through everybody ganging together as a joint accountable action against any would-be alpha male. That produced morality. It was a very abstract model. Who are these everybody and why is the alpha male doing whatever he's doing? But at least reverse dominance does describe something that anybody who's worked with African hunter-gatherers, you will be very familiar with the idea of reverse dominance because it does happen. Boehm said that our forebears became egalitarian when they moralistically outlawed alpha male behavior. And I think he's right, he's absolutely right, but Boehm forgot about females. And I think that we've actually got to take notice of female strategies to understand how reverse dominance works. Did females then have a role in establishing social norms about sexual and economic exchange in countering alpha males? The grounds for supposing that we should gender reverse dominance simply come from Darwinian theory, the theory of sexual conflict, which is the main theory underlying the evolution of mating systems for all sexually reproducing species. And when it comes to late Middle Pleistocene emerging Homo sapiens, the trade-off or area of conflict in particular between the sexes will be how much investment, the amounts to give to very large-brained offspring. And the fact that we've got this drifting upwards of the brain size is indicative of, well, females won that war. They got males to provide greater subsidy. So if we're talking about gender warfare, here, females won that war. So then how did they do it? This is the social context that we envisage for war on the alpha male. Females with their kin are resisting any male in terms of sexual access who does not do adequate investment. And that's described by anthropologists of hunter-gatherers as bride service. A male has no sexual access unless he produces the goods, high energy foods that go to his wife and her kin. So we have this reverse dominance model, which we've called female cosmetic coalitions. In genus Homo, there is no good signal of ovulation, no precise signal of ovulation giving males information about female fertility. However, menstruation becomes a highly salient cue, not about fertility then and there, but about fertility in the near future. All males are going to be interested in such a cue. For females who are pregnant and lactating, a menstrual female is going to cause the possibility of loss of investment. So this situation causes conflict both for females and potentially for males. So the kin and you know, friends and neighbors of this menstruating female, one, they need to protect her, including male kin of that female. And then they want to confuse any of those males who might be prospective or intending to be alpha males and trying to grab that female. And the way that they can do it is simply by spreading the signal so that blood, or use more blood, or blood turns into some form of cosmetic or pigment as the strategy is developed. So what are the females doing here? They are absolutely saying no to any male who tries to approach without having adequate provisions to do so. Now, what the situation for these males is, non-investor males are being rejected in the female selection process. Investor males should be very happy about joining this game. They should be happy because the competition for males who don't want to invest, would be alpha males, is being thrown out. So we're going to have a mutual sexual selection process of females selecting investor males and investor males very interested in the ritualized behavior of these females. I very quickly, we've gone rather long, but I very quickly want to run the gender warfare against the outcomes that we were talking about, the possible issues of the warfare model. In the case of this gender warfare model, or reverse dominance, reverse gender dominance, sexual morality is absolutely integral to the strategy. Suddenly, women care what women are doing, men care what women are doing, men care what men are doing. We have the prospect of widespread chains of connection that go across the landscape with categoric kin in exchange with affines of sexual and economic exchange indefinitely. In terms of cumulative cultural evolution, we have a regular ritual replication with a focus on blood red pigments, as Ian has been showing us, and it will go in a consistent direction, exploding through forces of sexual selection. In terms of the signaling going on from coalitions, shared fictions are going to be a necessary part of the signals by female-based coalitions, female kin coalitions. One, because blood that isn't blood is being made out as blood. Also that women's blood and the blood of the game animals they want men to hunt, that will also, these metaphors will generate more and more metaphors. But the killer, again, is the question of the raising sufficient energetic support for the very large brains of the offspring. And that, as we saw, that is borne out in the second stage of speciation in MAS6, isotope stage 6. So Ian's told us about the evidence of ochre pigment. I just want to end on this slide from ethnography of African hunter-gatherer cosmology. We're looking at some Hadza young women and girls, initiates of Maitoko, who are engaged in battle. They're having battle with the boys. It is gender warfare, reverse gender dominance. The girls are armed with mythology about their ancient origins and armed with special sticks as weapons with which they chase and hunt and attack the boys, the young hunters who are their would-be lovers. So this is war, but it's play, but it's war. I'll start.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for and Chris and Ian for this very dynamic talk with the switching of the screens. It's proof that it is possible to have multiple speakers in Zoom. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Questions? If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand.
I think everyone's shocked.
Shocked. In fact, I would like to...
I saw Luis had a question.
Luis, please go ahead. No? No, he does not.
Oh.
Marie-Adrienne.
Hi, thanks for this talk. Yeah, I agree. I'm in shock as well because I agree with you. So I like the argument that you're making. It's not that, well, I'm not familiar with the literature so far, but to me, you make a convincing argument. But then it makes me think that, yeah, well, it's plausible that gender warfare, yeah, as you say it, could be like the main driver for cooperation in most things. But then, if you think of it, historically, and even now, men still, you know, claim credit for everything. Why is that? So how do we change that, you know?
I wonder why.
Well, that is, in our view, what makes it so important to have a focus and actually center and focus highly egalitarian African hunter-gatherers. We think that the models of symbolic evolution for humans have really got to pay attention to symbolic cosmologies and practices of African hunter-gatherers, because they can really teach us about what the world is like before patriarchy kind of clamps down in the ways that we are so historically familiar with. But we're talking about a species lifetime, 200,000-300,000 years, where women's potential for resistance, where it wasn't just crucial, is absolutely central to our emergence as a species. I don't know if Ian and Chris want to add some more on that.
Yeah, I could simply add that I think why this hypothesized situation we're outlining could last so long was because of material abundance, the abundance of big game that modern humans had, they'd co-evolved with in Africa. And I think that may well be why they've done better at maintaining relative gender egalitarianism. But as we spread out of Africa in the last 100,000 years, our very success as big game hunters contributed to the decimation of the big game and created this, the situation of sort of artificial scarcity, if you like, in which men could appropriate women as more permanent sexual and economic partners. And that's what we're all familiar with, generally speaking.
Chris.
Just really briefly, I mean, clearly hunter-gatherers have different gender dynamics, but immediate return hunter-gatherers, there's one thing they have in common, which is an initial period of matrilocal residence. When a young woman comes of age, she does not move away from her mum and her kin. And that's because the system, as Camilla said, is bride service. And with bride service, you have to have some leverage. And a woman with her mother and her sisters and her other kin will have some leverage against any male who's, you know, playing around, you know, harassing, or, you know, just being lazy. So, and Frank Marlowe did a wonderful, before he died, a wonderful cross-cultural survey of hunter-gatherers, just showing that matrilocal residence, at least initially, is the norm for hunter-gatherers. And that's very, very significant, because however much you might discuss how much power women do or don't have, the critical thing is where you live. And if you're living with mum, you've got quite a lot of power.
Can I have a follow-up question? Or?
Yes, but wait, there's first a question of Nick Enfield.
Maybe this is a quick question, I don't know, but I just love this stuff. Thank you. It was a really just incredibly stimulating talk. I have spoken to Chris several times over the years about this. Of course, read your work, and I've been thinking about the moon quite a lot actually recently. Thinking of you, Chris, in relation to this. but you didn't mention the moon at all in this talk. So does it play any role at all in this story, or is that it's just a kind of fun thing?
Over to Ian.
All right.
All right.
No, Ian, you do it.
Okay. No, it certainly very much does, and we're hoping to have a paper out shortly addressing precisely this. I briefly mentioned sort of abundance, and our current line of thinking is that during our two-stage evolution, a large part of that falls within a glacial, and African dry seasons getting enough food is hard enough under normal circumstances, and in a glacial it becomes even harder. And in particular, fat becomes very scarce. And what we're proposing is that with that second stage of our speciation, globularization of the brain case, and that last bit of brain size increase, what the female coalitions were mobilizing was a particular form of male labor in lunar phase-locked nightstand hunting, which this is restricted to the dry season, and it occurs around the nights of around full moon. And to this day, it is the most productive form of hunting practiced by the Hadzabe. And historical records suggest the same amongst the Bushmen as well.
Yeah. Could I just very quickly add, from an evolutionary perspective of menstrual cycles, that there is little doubt now that data is coming from menstrual apps that the lunar cycle length actually does correspond to mean cycle lengths, particularly for women who have lower end body weight, more like our evolutionary ancestors, for women in their 20s. And if you talk to a Hadza woman about her menstruation, as Catherine Fitzpatrick did a full PhD on this, a Hadza woman will say me, the moon will tell me when I menstruate, and the cosmology of the moon in relation to menstruation is just, it's very traditional.
Okay, so there's a question of Marie Adrienne and then Slavomir and Chris also. Okay, so Marie.
Yeah, so related to what was discussed earlier from my question, I'm thinking, because I'm from the Philippines, I'm Tagalog, I'm a native Tagalog. But I'm thinking my Tagalog culture is really egalitarian before we were colonized by Spain, US. So I don't know if you're familiar with the literature. I'm sure our local anthropologists here have looked at this already, and I wish they're here to talk to you. So, but I don't know. So I think because yeah, so it's not just in Africa. So I don't know. Well, obviously Mexico would be older than we Tagalogs are. So I don't know if you're familiar with the literature here in the Philippines, Southeast Asia. So
no, we need to know much more. I'm not familiar. No.
All right, so I'll tell my professors. Yeah.
Slavomir.
Okay, thank you. Hello, and thank you very much for your talk. Thank you for mentioning me. And my research, as you know, is very heavily indebted to your research and Chris's research, Chris Knight's research. And on that note, or along those lines, I have a question whether, so there was a recent paper, long story short, about animal communication, and the reason that was offered why there are no simple animal languages is that there needs to be, as a precondition for the evolution of languages, near absent conflict of interest. And this sounds good, but it has been pointed out that humans do not have near absent or zero conflict of interest, right? This is just a fact. So I wonder what your opinion is on this, that there is a dissociation between like general behavior and communicative behavior. And in general behavior, humans do not have near absent conflict of interest, but communicatively, we behave like signaling theory, kind of, if we were to describe human communication in terms of signaling theory, kind of behaves as if we do have alignment of interest. Do you think it's a good statement, or how would you comment on that?
Can I reply on that one briefly? the three of us were very heavily committed to Ahmad Zahavi's costly signaling theory, as I know you are, Slavomir. And so essentially, Zahavi is saying, language, yes, good idea, but it would never work. It's a theoretical impossibility, simply because, as you say, because you're going to get conflict of interest even between close relatives. And so we have to understand that's the blockage. That's what prevents even very intelligent great apes from getting anywhere near language. So what we're saying is that you need to be in a completely different domain. You need to be inhabiting virtual reality. And once you're in virtual reality, you're interested anyway. Even if something's a complete fiction, you're interested in one another's fictions. And to get into that virtual world, of course, as I think everyone here would recognize, I know Nick does, and any social anthropologist recognize, you need to have ritual. And when you're singing and dancing all through the night, drumming, singing, dancing, polyphonic singing, there's just a huge amount of time the hunter-gatherers in Africa and elsewhere, of course, spend singing and dancing. There may be conflicts of interest, but while you're singing and dancing, you're all in the same space and you're getting into another world. And once you're in that other world, conflicts of interest kind of, take a back seat. But obviously you're right. I mean, clearly, humans have conflicts of interest. Nobody doubts that, especially, of course, as we're saying, between the genders, because males will always try to, I'm one, males will always try to get a little bit more sex than we really deserve. There's always been those conflicts, but I think those would be the primary conflicts. They're conflicts which can be transcended, can be overcome. They're not like warfare between rival groups of males, which actually just, lead nowhere except to basically population, eventual extinction, of course.
Chris,
Okay,
Sinha.
thank you very much.
Just a brief footnote to what Camilla was talking about the female menstrual cycle and timekeeping and the moon. There is research by Vera da Silva Sinha on Amazonian groups in the Xingu Basin, and in these groups of Tupian people, they're agriculturalists, by the way. They're not hunter-gatherers, but they have very small number systems, which is relevant for reasons which are fairly obvious. But every woman has her own moon, which is basically, she identifies at her first, this is part of the initiation of women into womanhood. At her first menstruation, she's required to note the shape of the moon, okay? The shape of the moon at the lunar cycle. This becomes her moon, okay? And her moon enables her to do time reckoning about when to expect the next menstrual cycle and to know whether she is pregnant or not.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We need to move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much. Antonis, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. So our next speaker is Antonis Iliopoulos, who wrote a chapter together with Lambros Malafouris. Antonis, please.
Thank you very much. Let me start sharing my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So, in this paper, we shall be delving into the issues of symbolization and material signification as they have been conceived in the literature on human origins. So, in the first three sections, we shall be specifically focusing on three interrelated questions found at the crux of the debate on behavioral and cognitive modernity. Firstly, how did material objects signify in prehistoric times? Secondly, how were material science created at that point in time? And thirdly, how did material science and human minds evolve and change over time? These questions about the nature, emergence, and evolution of material signification have been addressed in very different ways by two broad schools of thought. The symbolocentric paradigm, which has for long been the favored approach, treats material science in linguistic terms, attributes their creation to predefined mental templates harbored by symbolically and linguistically capable brains, and sees their evolution as an adaptive response to selective pressures. Contrastingly, a more recent approach defines material science primarily based on their material qualities and relations, ascribes their creation to the anchoring of cognitive projections onto these physical manifestations, and approaches their evolution as an ontogenetic process driven by the prolonged engagement between humans and things. While we consider both perspectives in our handbook chapter, a limitation of time forces us to consider here the three questions in terms of the latter alone. Opting for a way of thinking that is not symbolocentric, we will be highlighting the materially sensitive dictates of person semiotics and material engagement theory. As we shall be ultimately concluding in the final section, the emphasis of these chronologically distant but philosophically proximate frameworks on the ontological primacy of process and situated engagement allows them to shed new light on the origins of mind and material semiosis. With this plan in mind, let us start with the first question. What is the nature of material science? As is revealed by the literature on early body ornaments, engraved pieces of ochre, figurative representations, rituals, and highly stylized tools, the debate on human origins has been long preoccupied with the referential function of artifacts, at the expense, however, of their pragmatic implications. Unpersuaded by the linguistic outlook on style, Byers introduced an action-constitutive approach, according to which artifacts actually substantiate rather than merely reference their meaning. As he proposed, style is the symbolic medium that allows users to bestow upon artifacts a form of derived intentionality, which in turn confers them with pragmatic power. Consider, for instance, how the style of a passport can afford its bearers with distinct powers, allowing them to fulfill their intent to enter a country. Style imbues a passport with the expressive meaning that constitutes it, making it what Byers has termed the iconic warrant required to cross a border. Along similar lines, a few years later, Renfrew coined the term constitutive symbol to denote a material sign where the symbolic or cognitive element and the material element coexist, are in a sense immanent, and where one does not make sense without the other. Based on the idea that meaning emerges when humans engage with the material world, Malafouris suggests that a significative artifact actually substantiates the meaning signified. That is, it operates on the principle of participation rather than that of symbolic equivalency. According to the theory of material engagement, conflating material culture and language by treating the former with tools geared towards the latter deprives the material world from having an active role within the semiotic system, effectively leaving a large part of the significative spectrum unexplored. To avoid the fallacy of the linguistic sign, that is, the erroneous tendency to treat material culture in linguistic or textual terms, a new wave of thinking in evolutionary cognitive archaeology has recently outlined the usefulness of praxis-oriented approaches that ground the material sign on the physical dimensions of our world. To clarify the ways in which the artifacts comprising the archaeological record would have participated in prehistoric cases of meaning-making, one could draw upon the theoretical insights of pragmatic semiotics. According to the pragmatic semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, a sign or representamen stands for something else, its object, not in all ways, but in some respect or capacity, which he called the sign's ground. In adding to the symbolic grounds generally associated with language, Peirce made a widely adopted distinction between iconic and indexical grounds. While the former pertained to relations of similarity, the latter pertained to relations of spatiotemporal contiguity and factorality, that is, the relation between a part and the whole. Surprisingly, while these types of non-symbolic signification have proven especially insightful in the semiotic study of historic artifacts, they remain somewhat underexploited in evolutionary cognitive archaeology. Moreover, while the differentiation between icon, index, and symbol may have helped considerably in identifying the kinds of relevance between past material signs and what they could have stood for, other aspects of semiotic functioning remained unaccounted for until recently. According to some of our recent research, attending to the trichotomy about the sign's relation to itself allows archaeologists to differentiate between three states of meaningful being: possible quality, actual thing or event, and general rule. It is worth noting here that if we expand our analysis even further so that it also includes the third of Peirce's triptychs, then our semiotic analysis can gain even more in analytical precision. Attending to the way that the sign relates to what Peirce has termed the interpretant, that is, the effect of the sign on the mind, allows us to establish whether a material sign denotes, informs about, or dictates its meaning. What pragmatic attempts ultimately seek to demonstrate is that a detailed reading of Peirce's theory with all three kinds of his triadic relations can help us describe the semiotic nature of prehistoric artifacts quite accurately. On this note, let us move on to the second important question. How did material signs emerge? Faced with this issue, the proponents of the traditional dictum generally subscribe to the idea that material culture is the epiphenomenal product of pre-existing ideas and dispositions, essentially assuming what Ingold has dubbed a helomorphic model of creation. Yet, while representationalist approaches became increasingly influential in cognitive archaeology, their assumptions have not been accepted without contestation. From a hypostatic point of view, meaning does not reside in the brain per se, but emerges through the process of engaging with material things and objects. Philosophically speaking, this proposal has much in common with enactivism, a theory that sees cognition as an embodied engagement in which the world is brought forth by the coherent activity of a cognizer in its environment. Seeking to introduce the enactivist program to the study of material culture, Malafouris moves past the representational idiom by positing that it is possible for humans to think through things in action without the need of mental representation. From the externalist point of view, material engagement theory treats material culture, treating material culture as a mere vessel of external medium of cognition and invoking a representational mechanism in order to explain the relation is a theoretical pitfall that has been accordingly dubbed the representational fallacy. From the long-term perspective of material engagement theory, the protracted flow of cause and effect between brain and material culture is best considered to have been bidirectional. To account for the co-emergence of sign vehicles and meanings, the theory of material engagement draws particularly upon the cognitive anthropological work of Hudson's. Influenced by his materialist take on the conceptual blending theory, Malafouris puts forth the hypothesis of enactive signification, a working hypothesis according to which a material sign emerges through a process of embodied conceptual integration that is based upon the anchoring of cognitive projections to material culture. As enactive attempts ultimately seek to establish, this sort of conceptual blending in a hylonoetic space differs from the unidirectional projection of predefined internal templates into a passive external world, because the integrative approach of material engagement theory is instead guided by a logic of participation. And with this, let us now move on to the final of the three questions posed initially. How did material signs evolve? The communicative function of significative artifacts is usually seen as a cultural adaptation that followed previously acquired neurocognitive adaptations bestowed to our prodigious ancestors through one or more genetic mutations. While we do not, of course, doubt the role of natural selection as a prime mover of diachronic chains, The neo-Darwinian approach does not really grant materiality with an active role in the story of human evolution. According to the theory of material engagement, human beings evolve by creating material things and assemblages which scaffold the ecology of our minds and shape the boundaries of our thinking. We thus suggest that the creative impulse of humans must also be recognized as a catalytic factor in their evolution. From where we stand, studying their evolution proper requires attending to the creative ways in which their plastic brains could have been integrated with the ductile objects that made up their worlds. This entails acknowledging that the relation between their neural and their cultural plasticity is itself malleable and dynamic, a fact that calls us to recognize metaplasticity as the defining characteristic of our species. What this concept allows us to do is explore the diverse ways through which humans and artifacts must have come together and situated actions that generated meaning. In the case of early body ornamentation, for instance, ochre pigments and cell beads would have come to function as material signs that provided information about their wearers because biology and culture have been brought together in the same ontological locus through the very act of attaching artifacts onto bodies. Of course, the initial interpretations of early humans would have veered towards haphazard guesses, especially when first presented with unfamiliar facts which cast doubt on the meanings grasped. Given that what is interpreted as an informative sign is not always true, humans would have been faced with the task of evaluating their interpretations against the backdrop of perceptual cues and prior experience. Essentially then, they would have had to learn how to think about thinking. From the point of view of material engagement theory, the awareness that came with the development of meta-representational thinking would have been instrumental for the conscious manipulation of the rich array of signs that make human culture and symbolic systems so unique. As we see it, tracing how material science provided the semiotic scaffolding that drove the evolution of cultural practices calls for a framework that can accurately describe a broad semiotic spectrum, ranging from iconic and indexical signs, such as communicative artifacts, to symbolic syllogisms, such as those guiding rituals. In order to follow this evolutionary transition from the more concrete to the more arbitrary, our typology should also be able to account for the interrelations between different kinds of signs. This is why we must return to Peirce's three triads of semiosis and put them together in order to get a tenfold typology, which allows us not only to accurately describe the nature of past material signs, but also to appreciate their role in broader contexts of semiosis and meaning. Case in point, its application to prehistoric material signs, such as early body ornaments. Unfortunately, there's no time to explain this in detail. One thing we should keep, however, is the fact that the meaning of material culture must have been multi-layered rather than one-dimensional. We must thus arrive at the conclusion that the evolution of symbolic narratives is best attributed to protracted processes of semiotic scaffolding, which would have been driven by cases of creative material engagement with iconically and indexically grounded signs. It should then follow that the evolution of symbolic material culture would not have been an all or nothing affair. It was rather the culmination of a prolonged evolutionary process that involved perceiving the relevance between two things, understanding that one of these things can stand for the other in some respect or capacity, recognizing that this relation can be purely arbitrary, and appreciating that this relation can belong to a syllogistic system of other such relations. Given that typification, sign function, symbolicity, and systematicity were probably distinct points in our semiotic becoming, it would be misguided to subsume them all under the umbrella of a symbolic activity. As might be expected, treating them as distinct cognitive achievements in the various spatiotemporal trajectories of our semiotic evolution, contradicts the key belief of the symbolocentric paradigm, that is the one according to which an organism has the ability to symbol or it does not. There are no intermediate stages. If a symbolic capacity is any way to define a modern mind as such, then it seems that we must also rethink our search for traces of modern human behavior and cognition. Not surprisingly, the incremental achievement of semiotic milestones at various places and times across the prehistoric landscape is largely incongruent with the widely held assumption according to which the symbolic capacity that made humans modern was bestowed to parental groups of hominins through one or more culturally adaptive genetic mutations that enabled them to cross some sort of neurocognitive Rubicon. Given our critical perspective, we join the growing minority of scholars that have called for the elimination of modernity as a notion from the debate on human origins. Clearly then, we propose moving towards a materially sensitive account of human origins. As we have seen, a new school of thought has called attention to the fact that besides, of course, being able to signify arbitrarily, significative artifacts can also stand for something else by way of similarity, spatiotemporal contiguity, and factoriality. In fact, the physical qualities and relations they embody and enact make them prime candidates for an iconic and/or indexical mode of signification, at least in the beginning. In revealing how the real world can scaffold the emergence of novel concepts, a pragmatic take on the nature of material science sets the foundations for a hylonoetic approach to creation. Rather than seeing the mind as a computational device that processes symbolic representations about the world before externalizing them as epiphenomenal products, the proponents of this enactive view suggest that cognition is brought forth by physically engaging with the material world. The theory of material engagement thus avoids treating cognition as a brain-bound process, opting instead for a process-based philosophy, according to which the mind emerges from the inextricable folding of brains, bodies, and things. Rejecting symbolocentric theories of cognition, methodological individualism, and representational nativism ultimately leads us to a post-genomic take on the evolution of material culture and material signification. Contrary to the idea that biological and cultural evolution follow parallel yet distinct trajectories, the notion of metaplasticity seeks to account for diachronic change in the way plastic brains and things have been integrating in developmental contexts. As we see it then, evolutionary cognitive archaeology might benefit from reevaluating some of the theoretical assumptions made when studying the origins of symbolism. We should note at this point that apart from theoretical reasons, methodological difficulties also preclude us from making any definitive statements about when and where symbolic artifacts first appeared. If we restrict the notion of symbolism to purely arbitrary signs, so as to distinguish these from iconic and indexical signs, then the actual connection between a symbolic artifact and what it stands for is virtually undetectable in the prehistoric archaeological record. As Sonesson points out when discussing symbols, there is nothing in the expression and the content of the sign that explains the sign relation that produced the relevance between them. Given that the cognized categories held by past minds cannot be directly accessed, attempting to gauge the presence of symbolic meanings from prehistoric artifacts does not seem promising. As it turns out, though, while the chronological version of when symbolism first appeared cannot be confidently addressed, exploring the deeply ontological version of when it evolved is, in fact, possible. From a pragmatic and enactive point of view, accounting for the evolution of material signification basically entails tracing the process of change in the prehistorically situated perceptions and conceptions of different kinds of artifacts, not necessarily non-utilitarian. Since we cannot access prehistoric societies directly, we can never be certain about whether any particular artifact had actually been taken to stand for something else in some respect or capacity. What we can, however, garner are opportunities for the scaffolding of sign function. All we need to do is focus on whether the unearthed objects might have afforded the perception of similarity, contiguity, and/or factoriality. Recognizing that a thing or an action could have been seen as iconically or indexically relevant to something else at least accounts for the availability of the grounds required for the development of iconic and indexical signs. And once humans discovered that a thing can expressively stand for something else, the development of purely arbitrary connections with abstract contents would have been less of a leap, especially if we consider that the development of symbolic concepts reduces the cognitive load stemming from the accumulation of many physically grounded meanings in the same sign vehicle. It is easy then to see how the propositions resulting on the basis of these concepts could have been in turn associated with other such propositions, themselves probably based on other kinds of material signification, effectively scaffolding the development of symbolic narratives, such as those involved in rituals. Unlike language-like systems, which are characterized by many-to-one associations and one-to-many associations between their elements, these cultural practices would have taken the form of syllogisms connected through one-to-one associations between premises, building towards a conclusion. In seeking then to uncover the systems guiding the use of representational and communicative practices, evolutionary cognitive archaeology might have something to gain from replacing its formalist and structuralist understanding of material culture with a pragmatic and inactive approach that grants merit to the physical world for its role in semiotic scaffolding. So where does all this leave us? Well, if, as evolutionary cognitive archaeologists, we are to concern ourselves with a biological explanation for the evolution of human intelligence, then we must attend to more than the mechanisms of what the Greeks called as zoe, that is, the simple fact of living common to all animals. To really enter the post-genomic era as a discipline at large, evolutionary cognitive archaeology must wholly embrace what they call vios, that is, the form or way of living proper to an individual or group. By borrowing this fundamental categorical distinction from Agamben's political philosophy, we would like to hint towards the fact that biology is much closer to culture than we often tend to think. While biology is usually associated with a carnal manifestation of adaptive brains and bodies sculpted through natural selection, its etymological root seems to be much closer to an ontogenetic understanding of the term. It might be worth it then to opt for a developmental take on cognitive evolution, which essentially means attending to the finer intricacies of lived experience in prehistorically situated contexts of material engagement. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Antonis. Questions? Wim, no, it's an applause. Questions, please. Let me switch views. Nick Enfield, please.
Thank you very much. It's I just want to ask a question about kind of maybe just to clarify my understanding of what you want to mean by a symbolic relationship. You know, you laid out the kind of Peircean way of talking about what a symbolic meaning is. And I just want to ask if you could comment on how I understand that. So I'm trying to understand how the symbolic relation is for you, whether it's essentially social in kind or whether it requires purely some kind of cognitive leap. And the reason why I ask is because my understanding of the symbolic relation is the following. So you have a sign that stands for an object, You know, if it's an iconic relation, it's because the sign resembles the object. If it's an indexical sign, it's because the sign is somehow, you know, connected to the object in some way. But if it's a symbolic relation, my understanding is that means I take X to stand for Y because everybody else does. And I know how people respond to that sign, and I know that they take it to stand for that object. So that's what I'm going to do. So the causal basis of a symbol in that, on that sort of understanding is social, unlike the other two. And in fact, I think it relates directly to you know, what Chris and Camilla and Ian were talking about in relation to you know, you know, social facts, basically, concepts that we entertain because everyone else entertains them. So I'm just raising that understanding of what a symbol is, that it's essentially makes reference to the rest of the group, as it were. I just want to check whether that underlies the same understanding that you have when you talk about social meaning on that Peircean model, symbolic meaning rather.
So if we go by what is an orthodox way of seeing it from Peirce's perspective, then we're talking about a symbol being a habit. The thing is, though, that I wanted to make a finer distinction that I make based on the work of a contemporary semiotician who's influenced by Peirce called Goran Sonesson. And basically, a symbol is when you define it negatively. So when the thing, when the sign and the thing it stands for are not connected through similarity or indexicality. So the connection is purely arbitrary. Now, as far as
this is what I was sort of getting at. Sorry, go ahead.
So it's defined by a purely arbitrary connection. So it's held entirely in the mind. So a symbol is not something you can detect outside. That said, of course, humans have now reached the state where we can see things and understand that other people see them as the symbols we see them as. And here is where another of Peirce's triptychs, the second one I included, the one that makes a distinction between possible qualities, actual things or events, and general rules, comes into play. And that is the connection between the sign and itself. So not the connection that we've been having in archaeology between the sign and the object, but how does the sign itself means? So if we talk about the third level of this distinction, a sign can mean as a general rule. And a general rule is not something in the Platonic sense that it's up there, you know, elusive, and we try to, you know, grasp and instantiate, but it's something that emerges from actual manifestations, individual single manifestations of things. And this is where joint attention comes into play. So if I'm observing something with other people in my group, and we see the same actual thing or event repeating itself over and over, the general rule emerges in our minds that things work in this way. And this general rule is something that I want to emphasize is not something restricted to symbols alone. It's something also that also applies to icons and indices. So, for instance, if I see certain, you know, paw prints on the soil, along with other people, we can both share the understanding that, you know, these are the paw prints of that sort of animal. So, you know, I don't need to restrict, you know, the social understanding of something to symbols alone. I can apply it to other kinds of signification, as in iconic and indexical. I don't know if that addresses the question.
No, I'll pass on to the others, but only to say that I feel like what's missing is the cause of what causes this to stand for that. And to me, with a symbol, it's really the social, if you say habit, it can't be an individual cognitive habit, but I won't take it up. I'll pass over. Was it Chris or, yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Shall I go? Yeah, if it's me, can I, or is it Velikovsky?
Please go, yes.
Okay, I think I have the same problem as Nick. I mean, in your talk, you covered just about every conceivable topic, I suppose, in semiotic theory, but I need to boil it all down. So just can I ask quite a simple question. Is this a hypothesis? And if so, is it testable?
That's the thing with our field. How can we, really test what people thought 75,000 years ago at Lambros Cave? All I'm suggesting is not how things were, but I'm making the switch about how things could have taken place. So basically, instead of looking backwards and looking at specific artifacts and saying that happened there, having realized that there's no actual way to pinpoint what those people actually thought, I'm saying that by, we find these Lambros cell beads, they could have provided the scaffolds for the eventual emergence of symbolism at Lambros or elsewhere in this sort of way. But I have no way of looking back and saying, okay, the Lambros beads meant that.
I mean, we may not know what they thought, but we do know they produced ochre, and it seems to be the only thing, we've got in archaeological terms, which can allow us to make some, develop some kind of test for a theory. And you did. I know there's no reason why you should discuss ochre if you don't want to, but I mean, we need to home in on something concrete, don't we? Really, to have a thesis. And I find everything you're saying very, very sort of general, and therefore I can't pin it down, and I can't know whether it's true or not, or even if you want anything to be true or not true, as opposed to discussing these topics.
I actually use ochre in my paper, so I can definitely send you a paper. The cell beads are the end point, but before I go to cell beads, I started by discussing ochre. So I'm 100% with you on that. I can send you my paper. You'll see how I build an ochre and eventually reach the cell beads.
Thank you.
Definitely.
JT.
Oh, thank you. Antonis, thanks for your talk. I love that because when you were talking about Malafouris 2013, you had a model of 3 different things. One was mental. Sorry, I can't recall the other 2. It correlates with a theory I've been working on that all units of culture could be taxonomized as ideas, processes, or products. And it seemed to be very parallel to me. So I might even send you one of my book chapters to see what you think, because it was very similar to what you were saying. One other quick idea. In that chapter that I'm talking about, I'm looking at how numbers, let's say numbers came somewhere after ochre, in terms of somebody putting a mark on a stick to count 1 or 2 or 3, looking at how some notation systems, the number 1 is sideways, it's not vertical, and the number 2 is 2 strokes. And they say, this paper I read said that somebody writes 1, 2, because 2 looks like a Z because they're meant to go 1 and 2, but they were a bit lazy and didn't lift their pen up or their carving implement. So we still have the number 2. And the number 3 is 3 stripes this way, but again, they're kind of joined at the side. So thinking we still have these numbers 1, 2, and 3 that sort of have these evolutionary origins of sideways marks on sticks or cave walls or something like that. In your classification, and maybe with what Nick was talking about before, would that be a symbol or an icon or an index? How would that feed into Persian semiotics, I wonder?
So if we're talking about lines that correspond to something else, then we would say that they're icons because one line corresponds to one thing. A second line corresponds to 2 things. But there are other ways of, notation systems where they have these little clay objects that they would imprint on clay tablets, and those would leave a sign. And then we're entering the indexical territory. But as far as those that you described, I would say probably iconic. And obviously, the more they became abstract, let's say, I don't know at what point the 8 turned sideways started standing for infinity, but then we're entering the symbolic territory. So it's a process, and it's really hard to draw a line, because one thing with semiotics, and at least what I started realizing through Peirce's framework, is how different kinds of signification all come into play at the same time. It's just that sometimes different facets of them are emphasized more than others. So maybe the symbolic more than the iconic. But the fact that many come into play at the same time is something that's important, I think, to realize, rather than drawing strict distinctions between them.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Antonis, for your very interesting talk. And with that, we have already ended the first session. So we will resume today at 1:30 in Lisbon, London time, which is 2:30 in Germany and the rest of Europe. So we're having a break now of 1 hour. And so I want to thank all the speakers, and very kindly so, for having been present here. I want to thank Protolang for hosting our event. I want to thank Chris and Andy and all the speakers and the audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you all too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.